So if you preach regularly, you likely want to get better at preaching. The question is, what can you practically do to improve other than just preach whenever you have the opportunity? Well, today on Practical Church Planting, we're going to give you 7 practical things you can do to improve your preaching.
Thanks for joining us again today on Practical Church Planting. Today, we're going to be giving you 7 practical tips for getting better at preaching.
That's right. And before we jump in, just a reminder, if you're listening to this in real time, today is the last day to get the practical or the Growing Your Launch Team course, only $99 before it goes up. practicalplanting.com/launch. If you're 2 years or less from launching and you want to have an actual plan, not just like ideas of like, how do I reach people? How do I raise money? But what to do? You want to check it out today. We're really excited about the course, whether you're listening to this in real time or later. It's always going to be available, practicalplanting.com/launch. You can get all the info there, and you should check it out.
Check it out.
So here we go. 7 tips to get better at preaching. We've done a lot of different various preaching episodes and stuff like that, how to be more engaging, whatever. But if you're newer, I mean, really just in general, but particularly if you're a church planner or you're newer to preaching every week, and you're like, what do I actually do to get better? It's not just preaching every week. That's a good thing.
That does help. Yeah.
But what can I do to like actually get better at it as opposed to just doing it? And if I'm not good at it now, if I don't do things that help me get better, I'm probably not going to get that much better.
Yeah, and I think especially if you're not getting feedback from anybody, then just
You
preaching
have no
all the
idea.
time. Then preaching all the time, it really is not going to. It'll help you get comfortable, but it's not going to really help you fix any potential issues or anything like that.
Yeah, you know the phrase "practice makes perfect" is incorrect.
Yes, correct.
Practice makes permanent. If you practice wrong, you will play wrong.
I've also heard, how's it put? Perfect practice makes,
There you go.
Something practice makes perfect. Get better at your practice, and that's how you become good.
Good practice makes you gooder. That's the point of this episode.
Yep.
So here we go. Again, we like to do practical things. I think some of these you might not have heard of. Some of them you may have heard of. But if you do these things, you'll get better. Here's number 1. Preach the same sermon multiple times. So it is helpful to preach just in general.
Yep.
But one of the best things you can do is preach the same sermon more than once so that you can actually apply some of the things that you're learning. I just remember when we went to 2 services, some point back in New City's history, even though we're not even that old. That was for me it was one of the most helpful things that I didn't even realize. Like I just thought like, preaching twice as much because you're preaching two times on Sunday instead of one will be helpful. And that was helpful, but the bigger helpful thing was preaching the same thing 2 times in a row. Because then it's like, here's some things I would have done. I would have slowed down here. I would have emphasized this. And then you actually get to do it again.
Yeah.
I've heard this from other people as well. If you're preaching at a youth ministry thing or a college thing or young adults thing, like don't always, if you have the opportunity, don't just write a new sermon every time if it's a different environment. Use the same one and preach it again because it will really allow you to work out some of the things that didn't go as well the first time and kind of see what they sound like. It's different if you preach, one service every Sunday and you're just like, okay, I didn't like this. I'll try to think about it for next time. And then you kind of forget, or it's a different sermon and you've never preached it before. So you're just focusing on the content instead of getting better. And if you preach something more than once, it's more internalized. And so if you can find ways to preach the same sermon multiple times, I have found it is one of the best things that you can do to improve your preaching.
Yeah, I think that's really good, especially if you're a church planter in the planting phase. In other words, you're not actually preaching every week quite yet. Then it can really help because if you're a periodic preacher, like if you're a resident and you get to preach periodically, or you're not quite to the point where you're doing it every week, then the amount of time that can go between preaching each sermon could be a while, and they could be vastly different to where you're not really carrying that much over from sermon A to sermon B. If you're preaching on a completely different topic, or if it's a completely different setting, and you don't have the opportunity to use really any of the same material that you used before, then it's still helpful to get more kind of reps, but you're really not going to be able to work out most of the issues that you may have faced the first time, the second time.
Right.
So
finding places to preach the same sermon multiple times. I mean, even if it's not back to back, even if it's a couple of months out, it's just revisiting the material. You're more used to it, and you can work out some of the things that weren't as good the first time. So
yeah, I gotta say, like especially in the very early on, when you only get a chance to preach something once, it's almost disheartening because it's like you realize like, this, especially if you go back and listen to yourself, which you should in the beginning, but like you realize like, there's these things I didn't explain this well enough, or I didn't get through this, and then you're like, well, I might never have a chance to do it again
Yeah.
if you don't actually
And what
do
I was
it.
saying is, you think, okay, so next time when I'm talking about stuff, I'll try to explain it better. But it's just different, and you know from that sermon exactly what you would do differently.
Yeah.
So if you can try it differently, it'll help you internalize it better. So
Yep.
preaching the same sermon multiple times. Now, you might say, Dylan, Brian, I don't have the opportunity to do that. What do I do if I'm not
issue.
preaching all these places, or I don't preach at 2 services? How can I get better? Well,
We have a way.
we have a way. We are very big proponents of this, and that is preaching your sermon out loud on your own multiple times. Preaching it out loud. Again, this is just, I'm always surprised at when I talk to planters, people who are preaching for the first time, people that don't preach that often, and will to be talking, that they didn't go over their sermon. You know, like
that's
they're like, oh, I kind of ran out of time, or I went too fast here, or I didn't know it was going to come across like this, and they didn't go over it out loud. Now, I don't know. I thought that was just something that you would assume that you would do.
Sure, yeah.
I think some of it might be because you might see other preachers who are good, and you might assume that they don't, or maybe they don't, and they have a lot more experience. But preaching it out loud, just in general, if you want to make your just an individual sermon better, preach it out loud.
Yeah.
But if you want to get better in general, preach it out loud multiple times. Now, it's not the same as being in front of people, because you can stop and slow down and think, and you don't have the pressure to keep going that you do if people are watching. But it is still much better than nothing. When we started New City, you don't have to do it how I did it. This is just how I started.
Yeah.
We Monday, Tuesday. So, well, once we got into a rhythm of getting a little bit of ahead, like a week or two, now we're a lot ahead. But typically, what it would look like is Monday, I would kind of be a week or two ahead. So I'd get the sermon notes down and kind of go over it as I did it, and then I would go over it out loud Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So 3.5-ish times I would go over it. Now it's less. Monday I just reduce my sermon notes week of, because I've written them in advance, and then I go over it out loud Tuesday and Thursday. Tuesday I'll kind of stop here and there, and then Thursday I'll just actually do it. So it's not 4 times a week; it's 1.5 times a week.
Yeah.
But I've done it every Sunday for 4 years, so it's just a little different. I know how long things are going to take, so you have a little more experience. But if you want to get better, preach it out loud multiple times. It might feel awkward, but it just amazes me how people, if I don't know, it just amazes me the number of people that don't do this. And I don't mean this as a judgy or condemning way, but it's such an easy thing to do. And if you do it, then you can't wait until Saturday night or Sunday morning to finish your sermon, because you actually need to go over it. And you know what to expect. There's nothing worse than preaching the sermon as you're doing it. Be like, I shouldn't have said that, or this was a weird transition. When if you had gone over ahead of time, it would have gone so much better.
I will never understand someone who early on wouldn't do something like this. Even at this point where I'm a lot more comfortable than it was earlier on. I know how long things are generally going to take, how long a message needs to be. I would still be very uncomfortable going up without having gone over it out loud. It's just, part of it is because now it's kind of habit. That's something I do when I preach. But it's especially early on, man. If I hadn't done that the first handful of times I preached, it would have been no exaggeration. It would have been a disaster. Because the first times I had gone over it, I was like, whoa, this is much different out loud than writing. Your speaking voice is much different than your writing voice, so to speak. But I don't know. I think this is the number one of anything we're going to talk about. I feel like this is such a necessity if you're a young, newer preacher. You just don't know your voice yet, and you need to be able to say things out loud. And if possible, this is what I did earlier on, is I'd record myself doing it out loud to myself. No one else was around. I'd record
Brian
myself doing it
would come to the church when nobody was here.
That's
and do it
right.
From the stage.
I would come early in the morning and before anyone showed up, or late at night, and record myself through the sound system, because I knew if I did it at home just to my phone, I'm not gonna deliver the same way. And it's never gonna be perfectly identical to a Sunday morning, but I wanted to get as close as possible so I could figure out what I was doing wrong, if anything. And I mean, there was a lot. So do this, especially early on. There's just no reason I feel like you shouldn't, until you're really comfortable preaching and really comfortable with your content.
Yeah, and again, not only will it make that sermon better, but if you do this consistently, it will make you better faster.
Yeah.
Again, it's not the same as having people in front of you, but you're still going over the same content. You know what it sounds like. You're trying to work on your pauses. And I think maybe some of the reason not to do this is you think it's not as good. You think you should just be able to put it together and be great. But you have I don't know who you don't have to impress anybody.
Yeah.
And I just know through the years, as I've listened to different pastors talk and different interviews, I always have this assumption that the really good preachers just kind of did it. And all of them, I mean, they have different stuff, but as they've talked about, as I've heard pastors talk about their like writing process over, the really good ones, a lot of them also have a process that they go through. They don't just sit down, I don't know, Wednesday week of and throw something together.
Yeah.
They also, I don't necessarily know what they all are. They're all different, but a lot of the people who I thought, well, they're just really gifted and they just do it. They have a process. It's just like that, like a good musician or a good athlete. Everyone can just say, well, they're just really good. But a lot of times they're good, but they also worked a lot harder than a lot of other people who maybe had the same amount of talent, but didn't work at it as much.
Yeah.
So go over it out loud multiple times. It allows you to do your material multiple times and it makes you get better. And it's just good so that the sermon actually on Sunday is not as bad as it would have been otherwise.
Yeah, totally. And like, I'll go back to if you're still in like the pre-launch phase, and so if you're like a resident or something like that at a church and get a chance to preach occasionally, like I think that you, I don't know if this might not sound good, but I think that you have like an obligation to do this. I mean, I guess you kind of do regardless. But I remember the very first time I preached here at New City, or anywhere, which was here at New City. It was our first year as a church. And my entire thought process going up, and not saying this is like the right thought process to have, but I was like, I know it's not going to be as good a quality as a normal Sunday morning. You know, it's my first time ever. Of course it's not. But like, I owe it to the people that are coming to have it be as close as I possibly can.
Yeah.
And if I would have just written it and gone up there, I think that not only would it not have been great, which it's not like you're trying to like be great for myself, but it would have been a noticeable difference in quality, much more than it could have been for the people that are coming on a Sunday. And like, people aren't coming for me to practice. Like that's, you know, it's like, I get people like understand, especially if they know you and you're newer and stuff like that. It's not like it needs to be the exact same quality as someone who's been doing it for a long period of time.
Yeah.
But I think you owe it to do as much practice as possible because people are coming and giving time out of the day, and it's important material. Like it's I don't know, it's important.
Yeah. So preach the same sermon multiple times, and also preach the same sermon out loud to yourself multiple times as you're getting ready.
Yeah. And one thing I'll add, sorry, I have a lot of thoughts on this. Point 2A, little like sub point of this is, if possible, preach it out loud to a small group of people.
Yeah.
Like one thing we're doing right now is our young adults guy. He's preached it as recording this, coming up on his second time preaching here. And so, and this is what we did with me in the beginning too, is we just grabbed like the community group and brought them to the church and preached a message to like, whatever it is, 10 people or 15 people or something like that.
As you mentioned that, I had someone else reach out to me recently and was asking how we develop people to preach. And we don't have like a process for it, but everybody, so other than me, there's been 3 people that have preached semi-occasionally at New City.
Yeah.
And for each of them, this was like their first real experience. And so it was the same. They had to write a sermon, and we did like the message collab thing or whatever, and they gave it, and it wasn't even the sermon that they gave on a Sunday. It was just to do it.
Yeah.
And then with John, our most recent guy, he was good. We had him write his own sermon just ahead of time, and he gave it to a group of like 10 of us. And then when it was his first time preaching, it was the same thing. We did the message. We went over the message, whatever. He preached it in front of like the young adults. And then had time to tweak it. So even his first like 2 times preaching at New City, it's not even his first time preaching that sermon is not on a Sunday morning.
Yeah.
It's ahead of time, just to give them a little bit of some feedback to help them succeed better than otherwise.
Yeah, and it's really helpful to actually be in the setting. I mean, obviously, if you're portable, this may be, you have to figure out how this works, but to actually be in a setting of auditorium on stage, it's much different than just giving it to yourself to a wall. Both are helpful, but just helpful in different ways.
So yeah, if you're a church planner and you don't want to preach 52 weeks out of the year and you're nervous because you have people that maybe don't have a lot of experience what you should do, have them do a sermon that they're not going to give anywhere else, just them there.
Yeah.
And then when it's when they're actually going to preach on a Sunday, do the same thing. Like they don't have to write the sermon week of. It could be literally a month ahead of time.
Yeah.
And have them write the sermon, do all that stuff, preach it to you, give feedback, have them do it again if you want. And then when it's Sunday, it's not their first time.
Yep.
So, all right, number 3, listen to a couple of preachers at a time. So maybe, there could be a tendency, I'm just going to listen to a lot of people because I want to hear a lot of different tools and feedback and how people do it. I also got this advice, and I did this a couple years ago when I was like really trying to start to get better, not just to do it every week. I don't remember where it was, but there was a point where I just assumed by preaching every week I would get better. And you do get obviously better than not doing it, but I was just frustrated because I just felt that I should have, it wasn't progressing at the rate that I wanted to.
Yeah.
So I heard somebody talk about this, and so I listened to like 2 or 3 people consistently over a couple of months. So not 10 people, not 7 people, not even 5 people, but the people that are good. They don't necessarily have to be people in your theological tribe necessarily, but good communicators. I would pick good communicators, even if you will never be nearly as good as they are. It's interesting to listen to their pacing, their stories, how they do illustrations, what they emphasize, and that sort of thing, to give you a consistent feedback, or just expose you to something consistent to learn what they're doing. So I would recommend maybe 2 or 3 people that you really think are gifted communicators, and listen to them for a while. Don't be listening to like 20 people, because it's hard to learn from that different many styles.
I think it also helps to if you can pick people, and obviously this can like change over time. But if you know that you have a kind of a deficiency in a certain area, to pick some people that you think are really good in this area. In other words, if you're just like for an example, if you're a really low energy person and you think that that's an issue, not that that always is an issue, but if you see that as an issue, it might be good to listen to someone who's not necessarily like the polar opposite, where they're like jumping up and down and screaming, but like someone who you can tell actually is really good at maintaining energy.
Yeah.
Or if you like, one thing for myself, I notice if I'm not careful, and even sometimes when I am careful, I'm a fast talker. Sometimes I'm on the podcast, but like, and so one of the pastors that I like to listen to, it's actually a pastor I grew up with, but he's a very, not slow, but very, methodical in what he says. Like, he's very good at pacing, a lot of pausing and things like that. And I just know something that is not a strong suit of mine.
Yep.
And so if you can identify things like this, then finding pastors that can help, you can kind of learn from to help fill in some of those gaps, I think really helps.
Yeah. So not that you have to listen to them forever, but I would say for like 2 or 3 months, just have it on the podcast or whatever, and spend some time doing this, and you will get better than if you don't listen to anybody.
Yes.
So
correct.
All right, now let's see. Number 4. This is a big thing for me. Hopefully you wouldn't do this on a Sunday morning, although if you're a small church plant, pre-launch, or even if you've already launched, your church is small, you might feel like it's okay to do this. So don't do this on a Sunday morning, but also don't do this if you're doing this like as a practice run somewhere. And that is never give excuses when preaching in any environment. So never say things like, I haven't fully prepared the message, or I haven't fully internalized it yet, or, this is my first time, or I'm really nervous. Don't give any sort of caveats when you're about to preach. Now, most people aren't going to do this on a Sunday morning, but if they're doing it maybe in an area maybe they're somewhere they don't normally speak, or they're doing like a practice run like we had mentioned previous 2 points ago. Because when you do that, 2 things happen. It makes people like it makes people think less of what you're going to say, when if you had said the exact same thing without any excuses, they would have thought it was better and more effective. Like, they're just waiting for you to mess up. And secondly, it gives you the excuse to not have to preach a sermon. Because if you tell people, hey, I'm still working on this, I don't have it all together, then you can stop somewhere and like, you don't feel bad because you told people this might happen. You might not say I might stop, but you've kind of said, if something happens, be expected. Whereas if you don't say that, it forces you to keep preaching if you're lost, or if you get stumped or something like that. Like, you don't have the backdrop of like, well, I told them this might happen. You have to keep doing it. And again, most people aren't going to really notice, because when you're on stage, you think a pause lasts 20 seconds when it lasted 1, Right. So like, you think it's a lot more awkward than it would be otherwise. But whenever you are preaching in any environment, never give an excuse, because people are not thinking like that. They're going to think it's fine, even if you don't think it's fine. Even if you didn't have a lot of time to prep, something came up last minute, I would always just don't give an excuse, because then people will think less of it, even when they wouldn't have otherwise. And it gives you a reason not to. If you want to get better, you always want to be in an environment where I'm going to preach this without like letting something happen and it being okay.
Yeah. The first, like we mentioned, how we do this kind of, if it's your first time preaching in front of a smaller group. When I did that a few years ago, it was when we recorded it, so that you can go back and listen. And it's awkward, because obviously you don't have anything else, like you don't have any other sermon elements, or service elements to like anchor yourself to. So it's just like, go up and start. And I remember when I went back and listened to it, it was like, it was so much more embarrassing than, it's always going to be embarrassing, obviously, listening to yourself. But it was so much more embarrassing because there's a lot of pre sermon banter, if you want to say that, or just like talking about like how, wow, this is really awkward being up here, and it was just a group of a few of us, and everyone knew it was awkward. So like, it's not like no one probably in the moment was like, ugh, I shouldn't have said that, but it definitely gave kind of a precursor or whatever to the sermon of, this is gonna suck. It stink. This isn't good.
Yeah.
And so it I don't know. So what I ended up doing as kind of time progressed, and I'd come here by myself and give messages by myself. Dylan, you probably don't know this. It's also embarrassing. I would full out hook up everything on our stage, like turn on our screens and everything like that. And we use a bumper video before the message. I would play the bumper video, and then right when it was done, I would just go into it.
Yeah. Because
I knew I needed to. One of the hardest things for me was the start. And in these practice runs, if the start was just kind of saying, this is really awkward, I'm not sure what to do, then I'm not practicing one of the hardest parts for me of the message. And so, not giving excuses when you're preaching. I think the biggest thing is when you practice, it needs to be exactly like what you're trying to do. And obviously you're not trying to do that on a Sunday morning, so you really shouldn't do that in practicing.
Yeah, so never get an excuse. And that will make you get better, because then when you're preaching, you won't have a reason not to try. Not that you would try anyway, but like the pausing or whatever, because you didn't feel like you were allowed to, if you tell people you can't. So just never get an excuse when preaching in any environment. That'll help you get better. Number 5, connect somewhere where you will be given opportunities to preach. So this is one of the big things for people, for pastors, people that want to church plant, people that want to preach more, is where do I get opportunities?
Yeah.
You have to connect somewhere where you can get those opportunities. So if you are somewhere, does the leadership know you want to do this? And if you're serious, if you're serious about church planting, you can't just be like, well, I'm going to do this. And here's what I've had multiple conversations through practical church planting with a lot of people. And one of the common refrains I often hear is, there's no churches that in my area that want to plant, or there's nowhere I can go to give me opportunities. And that isn't true.
Yeah.
A lot of it is two things have to happen. You have to be patient. So it's not going to happen right away. But you actually also have to look. You can't just have talked to like 2 people and it didn't work out and say, well, there's no churches.
Yeah.
There are churches that want to do it. In fact, recently on the Facebook Practical Church Planning Facebook group, which you should join if you're not in, I did a post of like which churches are, who wants to, I don't even know what I said, but it's like asking.
Like who's looking for residency?
Yeah, who's looking for like a resident. There was like 35 comments of churches that are saying, we are. Right. And so join the group, go search the group, or just, there are places where this can happen. And so you need to find a place where, it may not be on a Sunday morning, but you should find a church that you can actually do this with. Now, it depends on how serious you want to, if you are about this. This may involve moving to a church that will give you opportunities. Like at New City, we talk to people. We're always open to having people to plant, or like in Raleigh, North Carolina. Maybe moving to join what we're doing, or find a church, go on that group. There's probably a church near you that commented on there.
Yeah.
But you need to be somewhere that gives you opportunities to preach. And so if you're not, well, then you're not going to have opportunities. But you can't just be like, well, nobody wants me to let me do it. There are places that do it. You just got to be intentional about looking for them and finding them.
And I think this speaks to the importance of building relationships with churches other than your own. Like, even if you are in a church that maybe you're doing a residency in, you're not going to have a ton of opportunities. You're going to have a handful, which is good, but the more the better. And so I think building relationships with other churches, even if you're not going to necessarily be planting through them, of just church plants and things obviously to learn from, but also like in our example, if some random person contacted you, Dylan, and said, hey, I'd like to preach at your church on a Sunday morning, and you didn't know who they were, I don't even know if you'd answer the email. Yeah, I mean, it's, that's weird. I don't know who you are.
Even if I know who you are, if you ask me that, it's going to be no.
Well, that's true.
Unless you're like...
But like if someone contacted you who you knew, who's like, hey, I'm planting through X church who we know and know their process and looking for more opportunities, it's not necessarily going to be a yes, of course, but maybe we can have a conversation about what that looks like. Yeah, and it might not
be on a Sunday, but there might be another environment.
Right.
Or, we're not a large church, but we know other large churches in Raleigh that would all like that have youth and college, like would love people to help them out in that area.
Yeah,
and
totally.
Connect, look around, reach out, but you have to be intentional about this. Don't be like, I tried 2 places, it didn't work. Nobody wants to give me an opportunity. If you show that you're actually committed and you're invested, then you will get those opportunities as opposed to just wondering where you can preach. And I would say this, with all the COVID explosion of online stuff, that's great, but it's not the same. So just because you're maybe doing Bible study videos, which I think is good, I think more churches should do them, but it isn't the same as in person where there's the pressure, because the camera, you can stop and start, start over, you could edit it out. But connect somewhere where you will be given opportunities to preach. It may sound obvious, but if you don't currently have that, then you can't grow.
Yeah.
So that was number 5. Number 6, read books on communicating. Now, this might sound, well, duh, but this point is communicating, not preaching.
Yeah.
So there are books about preaching, which is helpful, and a lot of them are how to exegete a text and that sort of thing, which you'd need. But this episode is about getting better in terms of like your skill level. And so, yes, you want to preach the Bible accurately, but you also want to learn how to be a communicator. So you can Google like top communication books. There's some TED Talks one. There's one, I forget the author, but Do You Talk Funny by a comedian, which is I recommend to pretty much any preacher because he talks about how to use humor and how it's really, in the book, as a side note, he says like people think comedians are just funny. And he said most of them actually are not funny.
Yeah.
They just develop the skill and here's how you do it. Of course, it helps if you're naturally funny, but you should never say, well, I'm just not funny, because in your own sense of humor, you can be funny if you work on it. Just like you can get better at preaching. Not everyone's going to be the best preacher ever, but you can get better than where you are if you work on it. So I would recommend courses, books that are about communicating in general, not just preaching. And in fact, if you're in church planning, you're probably used to getting resources on preaching. So don't even look for preaching.
Yeah.
Look for resources on how to be a better communicator and try to work on some of those skills.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. I think sometimes we can be afraid to look sort of in the secular world for resources when it comes to things like this because it seems less spiritual, but people are experts on things for a reason. And I don't think there's anything wrong with looking outside of, seminary text or outside of Christian literature to improve on things.
Yeah.
I think it's a
and
good
that's
idea.
impacted us, me, in terms of style, jokes, even screens, like how we do our screens. Was from stuff that we saw, that wasn't like for preaching necessarily. It's just like how to do better presentations and what your screens is. So it's like all of these things connect because people are just people, whether they're Christian or not. People respond the same. It's a good communicating or not communicating. So find books or resources about communicating, not just preaching, and that will help you become a better preacher if you can communicate better.
Yes.
So that was number 6. And then number 7, would encourage you to preach expositional sermons or sermons that are, I don't know, verse by verse or however you want to say it, through a book or a passage as opposed to a topical sermon or topical sermon series if you have multiple opportunities to preach. Not saying that topical sermons are bad. I'm just saying that you don't learn as much. This is, I don't know how do I say this? In my experience doing topical series, we do both, although now we mostly just do books. Most of the time, topical sermons, I don't learn very much. It's like I have an idea.
Yeah.
Let me find some Bible verses to support this
Back
idea.
it up. Yep.
Now, you might, in some of your research, have your idea tweaked a little bit, but you're not going to be surprised. You're definitely not going to change your mind.
Yeah, true.
When you do, if you're like preaching through a book, there have been times where I've literally changed my mind. Like when we did 1 Corinthians 2 years ago, like my view on the gifting of the Holy Spirit changed. And if I had done a topical series on the gifts of the Holy Spirit, it would have been what I thought.
It's a good point, yeah.
Now, I'm not saying, again, just a caveat, I'm not saying topical series are bad, because if you follow Jesus and you've been following him and you've been preaching and you've been studying, like hopefully you have biblical ideas, so it's okay to talk about them. But if you want to become a better preacher, you have to learn to preach through the text. You have to learn the text. You have to learn, okay, how do I, what is the, for lack of a better way of putting it, what's the good ratio of how many verses should I read at a time before people lose interest? Or how many verses can I explain at a time before people lose interest? How often do I need to have a point or a story before people lose interest? Because you could be a phenomenal expositor of the text, but if you're boring, people don't care.
Yeah.
And so I have found that if you preach through books of the Bible or through chapters or through verses or whatever, just throughout, you'll actually learn more about the Bible because you have to study it. And you'll have to learn techniques about how to keep people engaged and when is there appropriate, like when should you do like I said, points or stories or that sort of thing so that people stay engaged. Whereas a topical series, you can kind of just do whatever you want and without forcing yourself to learn, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I think I totally agree. I think that, like you said, it can be really easy to be really boring, honestly, preaching just through a book.
Yeah.
Because especially if you like are fresh out of seminary, it can be easy just to translate it to a Bible class.
Yeah.
And so I think that takes practice, and I think that's a good thing to practice. And I just think that especially if you're newer, honestly, I hate doing topical messages. Like personally, not like I hate when the church does, but I don't want to preach when we do them. And it's not because there's anything wrong with it. I don't mean like one's better than the other, but I think it can be very easy to. I mean, this isn't like new to me, but I think it can be very easy to accidentally just try and defend your point of view. And not that always means like you're going to say something heretical and it's awful, but like, I don't think, like you said, I don't think it's very often that people go into it saying, I want to preach on this specific topic. Let me see what all the views are of it and then see what seems the most biblical. Maybe we want to do that, but I think it's most likely this is the way I feel about this. And then this is some text to support it. Yeah. And I think that's perfectly fine, but I think especially if you're newer, it might be a little bit more difficult to not just try and defend your own point of view.
So, especially if you haven't preached very much because you don't really know how not to do that.
Yeah, and like if you're younger in age, literally, you may not have really been exposed to all different points of view of a certain topic. Yeah. I think that's a great idea.
We've found too, people, as long as you're not super boring, at least we have found that people are actually, especially in our culture, are actually interested in what the Bible says because they don't know.
Yeah.
And it brings up interesting points, and it makes people more likely to listen because it doesn't sound like it's your idea. Now, it's always still your idea.
Yeah.
But if you ground it in the text, it has to at least give you some parameters on it, and it makes you really interested, and it allows you to speak and to preach out on stuff without making people upset. So it's a great example. Like recently, I don't know who I was talking to with, maybe it was our staff, but as we're recording this, Matt Chandler of Exodus, the Village Church in Texas, they're a large church, they're part of Acts 9, so whatever. They're preaching through Revelation right now.
Yeah.
And I just see like all this stuff on social media, it's like blowing up and people are like, this is great. Like, this is great. This is awesome. I'm learning so much, which is interesting because when people hear like Revelation, they're like, ooh, that's scary. Yeah. You're going to make people mad. Mm-hmm. But then and I haven't listened to this series, I should, because I keep seeing people talk about it. But when you're preaching through a text, it's like a lot of people have a lot of misconceptions. Actually, we'll see how this works because we're starting 1 Thessalonians in May, and it's also a lot about Jesus returning. But people aren't necessarily mad. It's because here's what the text says. Here is the way we've misunderstood it, and here's what the text actually says. You actually have to wrestle with it. People go from being defensive and mad to being, oh, this is really interesting. Yeah. And you might disagree, but if you haven't studied Revelation for yourself, for example, you can't just be like, well, he's wrong. Yeah. Whereas if you had done, we're going to do a 5-week series on the end times, and you could maybe, I haven't listened to it, but like you could do let's say a topical series-ish or whatever, just on the end times, and it's the same concepts as maybe he is doing his, but because it feels like it's your opinion because it's a topical series as opposed to walking through a book, people might become more angry and upset because people have very polarized opinions. Yeah. And often wrong opinions about the end times.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's good. I think you, I don't know. I think it's just, it's a good practice. Obviously, it's something that you need to get good at over time, and it's something that's not easy right off the bat to be able to explain text and things like that. So I think I don't know, why start late? I think it's good to start early and start preaching through it. And at the very least, like you said, you're going to learn a lot, especially if you're newer and younger at this. Yeah. You'll learn a lot about different books, even if you choose some of the shorter and easier to understand. Yeah. I think it's great for you personally, but it's great for people too.
Yeah. So those are 7 practical tips for getting better at preaching. Don't just think that as I preach, I will automatically get better. In the beginning, you will improve some, but you will definitely hit a wall if you're not being intentional. And if you do preach regularly, this is one of the most important things you do. So you want to get better at it.
Yes.
So speaking of getting better at it, again, if you want to grow your launch team to reach more people in your community for Jesus, practicalplanting.com/launch. You can get the Growing Your Launch Team course there. And we've heard a lot of good feedback from it, so we're excited about that. And also, as we mentioned, you can check us out on Facebook, Practical Church Planting. There's a Facebook group. Yep. So I think 940-ish people now as of this recording. So
creeping up on that 1,000.
Let's go. Help us hit 1,000.
That's right.
And we'll be with you next time on Practical Church Planting.